Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen,
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
and you're listening to episode 158. And this episode, we promise that you will get all of the value you put into this monetarily back to you in fun and enjoyment, and it will be commensurate with the amount of time you spend with it, because we are talking about what is your time worth in regards to playtime and price in gaming.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk lately centered around Spider-Man 2 specifically, but a lot of games over the last few years of lower hour count not being worth the full price tag. And there is some correlation to that. Some indie games, which are often on the shorter side, are on the cheaper $30 and lower. That one-to-one doesn't really exist, in my opinion. And there's a lot of reasons why, but this came up because Spider-Man 2, which is a AAA game, that was meant to be a full game, because Miles Morales was a full game, but it was mentioned that it was kind of like this offshoot side story and that the real sequel was coming later. The fact that you can complete Spider-Man 2 in 30 hours, you can beat the main story in 15. A lot of folks were like, oh, this is a AAA game. Why is it so short? This doesn't make sense. Whereas I am one of the people often yelling, I want shorter games with worse graphics, that whole deal. Because I like short games, I like indie games, but I mostly I don't want to spend 100 hours playing anything. And when I do, it takes me 2 years to beat, a la Persona 5 Royal.
Well, and that's something that is part of why it's such a nebulous thing. Because if you take video games and you compare it to whatever you see as equivalent media, none of the price points or none of the pricing structures of other media really apply to video games necessarily. You can pay different amounts for how a book is published, but you're not necessarily spending it based on how many pages it is or how many words it is. I spent $9.99 for this novella, where I could also spend $5.99 and get that novel, Highway Robbery, isn't necessarily, or certainly I haven't heard that argument. It may be out there, but the internet's a wild place. Movies don't charge more or less based on how long the film is. If there's more materials to it, maybe necessarily, but typically, if you go to a movie theater, you're going to get charged differently based on time of day, not by length of film. But that sort of comes down to distributor, which is more or less what this is about, where video games are put out by different developers, they're put out by different publishers, and based on what costs are being recouped or anything else, the pricing structure, especially now that we are in a mostly digital marketplace, it's all dartboard throwing as far as what it actually comes out to be, I think.
Well, yeah, and I think playtime also is a relatively recent concept, right? If we think back to the Nintendo and the Game Boy and early consoles of that era, the Atari, there was no cost correlation to playtime because most games were arcadey, most were meant to be replayed, and there was no price correlation to it for an arcade. I mean, you think about it, you're paying 25 cents to play until you die. It's you can't get a better deal than that. But I think it's one of those things that in the age of how long to beat, a resource that's been very important to me, and a thing that I use to track my backlog and some other stuff, we live and die by that a little bit. And I think to some degree, I do want to know how long I'm in for something. If I see something is 100 hours, I do take pause just because I have other things to play. But the only reason I've bothered to try juggling Alan Wake 2, Spider-Man 2, and maybe even start Mario Wonder is that all of those games are 15 hours or less. And so I feel like I can finish them between each other. But it's this idea that also as cost goes up with video games, each generation more expensive. Although games when we were younger were pretty expensive too. I think this is the first time we're really, really rising above the range that it's been. Because I feel like it's been between 40 and 60 for a while, hasn't it?
That's kind of a sticking point, I think, because there have been generations where there have been games that have cost up to $70. And a lot of that has to do with the way the technology worked.
Right.
Because you had N64 games that could cost up to $70 based on how large of a board you were dealing with. Sega Genesis games weren't priced equally based on how many megabits or megabytes were on the cart, but having more made it more expensive. One of the reasons amongst many why Sonic 3 and Knuckles were split up was if they were to sell it all as one cartridge, it would have cost, I think, somewhere in the $80 to $90 range if they wanted to recoup their costs. So there have been times in the cartridge era where limitations or extensions the price was passed on to the consumer, and we were dealing with close to $70 games, but those were exceptions. Those were things that people go, well, why is this one versus this one? I feel like this is kind of the first time we are looking at that price point as trying to be set as a standard. I don't have an inflation calculator in front of me to determine what that works out to or how much this is really affecting things one way or the other. But yeah, as far as looking at the hard number, yeah, I'd say this is the first generation where it's the norm.
Yeah. I mean, but also part of that is, and we talked about this a little bit in our previous episodes about physical media, it's like the price of a game is $70. Whether you buy it with the disc and box or not, it's still $70. And that's like a big question mark, right? Because you're clearly not paying for the cost of production, or are you? It's kind of a giant question mark. And so if we're ignoring the physical media costs, whatever they may be, to the people creating games, then what's that money for, right? I think it's very normal for someone in this age of consumerism that we live within, in capitalism, is to figure out what your money is worth and your time is worth. And I think to a level that's important. I don't want to waste my time on something. But that said, one of the coolest gaming experiences I had this year was an older game that was like $5 and took me 2 hours to play.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to argue, I think, in this episode, it's more important what you get out of that time than how much money you spent to get there. Now, Geoff and I come from a place where we are fairly privileged. We are able to get games with relative ease. We've, of course, gotten game codes as well. If you are someone who gets like to buy 2 games a year, I can see where this argument come from, right? 'Cause growing up, that was definitely the case for me, for sure, and I know it was for you. Like, if I'm only getting 2 games this year, and both of those games I finish in a few hours, I would be upset, because then I guess I replay those games, but I don't have anything else to play. Whereas now, both of us have no shortage of games to play. We often complain about it. And so I think that perspective also shifts how we attack this.
Well, and when all games were released as physical media for a console, there weren't really digital downloads for the Nintendo Entertainment System. There was a more set price for your games, for the whole package, and that definitely set a limit on how many games you would get within a set period of time. You could spend the same equivalent amount of money on a Steam sale and come out of it with 24 games.
Right.
So it's interesting to see where the too many games areas pop up in everybody's backlog. Everybody can have the privilege of too many games to play. But also to something you said earlier, Matt, we weren't necessarily, to your memory, running into this nearly as much of this discussion of how many hours is a gameplay experience in the 8-bit era. Well, it was the arcade roots. When we talk about how long a game experience is, we're talking about how long a single playthrough is. A lot of those games from the 8-bit era, anything with arcade roots, you watch a speed run of that game, it's less than 20 minutes.
Right.
But I have certainly spent way more than 20 minutes on Castlevania, on Ninja Gaiden, on Contra, because I would play it over and over and over again. I never reached the end of any of the Ninja Turtle games on the NES without a cheat code of some kind. And so, yeah, how long does it take to beat? I don't know, 22 minutes maybe? 30 minutes if you don't skip any levels. But how many hours are you going to be spending getting to the point where you can actually complete the thing? And that is the other shift, I think, in discussion that comes up here. There are still plenty of games that are released these days that are meant to be, oh, I beat the game, rack 'em up, start again. The amount of conversations I've had with people about Baldur's Gate 3 since Baldur's Gate 3 has been released that are like, well, I'm already planning on doing multiple playthroughs. If Baldur's Gate 3 was a 10-hour game, which it's not, that's still 30, 40, 50 hours of experience based on what people already want to do. And you can argue about density of content on the front end versus the back end of the game and what is being updated. But I think, yeah, a bigger thing to consider is a game something where it's 150 hours, you will play it once and never touch it again?
Right.
Is it 150 hours and you immediately want to dive into New Game Plus? Is it a 5-minute experience that you are forever changed by, and thus you are not going back? I don't know how many times I'm going to play the Beginner's Guide, but I'm really glad I played the Beginner's Guide. It all goes on that sort of back and forth, and so that's one of the other areas where it makes it very difficult to sit here and calculate a cost-fun spreadsheet, which now I kind of want to see, because I want to see how people interpret that.
For sure. The first time I think I actually came to this like cost time fallacy was with the Xbox Live Arcade. There were a lot of actual arcade games ported to it. And I remember as a kid, those arcade games taking hours to beat because you're feeding quarters, you're playing with other people. But once they came to Xbox Live Arcade, the Simpsons Arcade is the one that comes to mind specifically. You had unlimited continues, unlimited lives.
You just hit the bumper and you got another quarter.
And it took me 30 minutes to beat. And I was like, this can't be right. This game took longer than that. And I don't remember what I paid for it, maybe $20 on XBLA, 10, 20, who knows. But I remember going, oh, well, that's kind of a ripoff. But I think it only felt that way because I expected more of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know that it was the time itself. And like when I think about modern games now, I mean, Geoff and I have both complained about how we don't mind longer games. But that's not what we're looking for necessarily. Although, then again, Geoff, as the Persona sicko, I don't know that we can actually say that about you. But I remember when I was playing through all of the Like a Dragon games before they were called Like a Dragon. Some of them are 30 hours. Some of them were close to 40 or 50 hours. The RPG, I believe, Like a Dragon proper was a lot longer than
something like
previous
that.
games.
Yeah, like 70 or 80 hours.
And so, like, I don't know that I got more value out of the games that were longer, but I do know that the games that were shorter, I was more inclined to do the side quests and do the bonus games and mini games because playing an 80-hour game that also has mini games, I don't know that I'm going to explore that because I want to get through it, right? The thing that has me excited about Spider-Man 2 is that this game is 30 hours to complete, which means I could do a ton of the side stories and still feel like I'm not spending months of my life playing it. Shorter games seem more appealing because I can get through them. I can get that sense of completion, that euphoria of finishing a thing, and then move on to the next thing. Whereas, as I've said several times in many places, I am still working on Persona 5 Royal because it's a long game that I want to play, but I'm playing it in fits and spurts between all these other games that I'm also playing.
So I think probably the medium of entertainment that I could most liken this to, because why not, is tabletop gaming. I mean, it's just another form of gaming, but think of value of pieces. Because again, yes, there are digital board games, they're video games, but how much are you spending for Twilight Imperium? And how many times are you going to have everybody there with enough time that you can sit down and play it?
Right.
How many rounds of Cards Against Humanity before you get sick of it and move on with your life? You know, I never want to play Cards Against Humanity again, but I will not trade back any of the games I played.
Right.
And the cost of those, one versus the other. I am also a huge fiend for solitaire games, for card solitaire patience games. And whether that's on the computer or I have a deck of cards, I like the tactile feel of shuffling and dealing and playing a round of Canfield when I've got a little bit of time to kill or something. And I think that's the other piece of a deck of cards doesn't necessarily have a rule set for any one specific game, but you can do a lot with it. And, you know, if you've got only Hollow Knight to play, you're going to find a lot of wild ways to play Hollow Knight, because I know that's how I played PS1 games, that I got 3 for Christmas and I'm not seeing any new ones until maybe one on my birthday. And that's what I'm getting unless I save up my allowance or whatever it is. You play them, you find it, you do it. And the games that allow for a denser experience or a new way to kind of assail its challenges, I think are going to go a lot further. In that same way that, you know, Matt, you were referring before to shorter games that take longer to come out, that idea of really where the value of what's charged kind of comes from the back end of the people behind it. And that gets into a whole thing that I don't even necessarily think we have enough time to cover for multiple episodes, which is creators valuing their work, and particularly in the independent circuit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that earlier, like a game, whether it's reached you or you had an experience that you'll never forget, like you mentioned, the beginner's guide. I mean, I think of the game Before Your Eyes and how I've played it only once, but I've also watched my friends play it several times, mostly so we can all get that sweet endorphin release as we weep uncontrollably together. It's one of those games that I don't know that I would ever play again myself, but I tell every person I've ever met who likes video games on any level and owns a webcam and a computer to play that game. And now it's on VR as well. I believe the PSVR has it, or PSVR 2 has it. But like, it is just a game where you blink to progress and the story is incredible. And you can finish it in an hour and a half. And I think I paid $14 for it. But like to me, that's an invaluable experience. Here's the thing, like I don't think people get upset if they pay $15 to see a movie. I don't even know if movies cost $15 anymore, probably not. And watch it once and they don't go, well, I didn't get my money's worth because that was only a 2-hour movie that I watched once for $15, right? In the same way that you buy a DVD and no matter how many times you've watched it, what's the value?
Yeah.
I think it's all mentality, perspective, and your means.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to poo-poo people who get upset about game time. I just think for me personally, and I think for a lot of folks who play games, the experience is what defines the worth. And I think maybe if you're upset about a short game time that you paid $70 for, are you really upset about the short game time or how you felt about the game? Because I think that means more, right? In the same way that we've both bought games that we've not finished, that we still loved or enjoyed,
Absolutely.
that sure, beating a game for me is like the intent. But there are tons of games that I look back on favorably that I've never finished that maybe I'll go back and finish. It's my constant battle with Final Fantasy X, a game that I get closer to beating every time I play it, but still have yet to finish it. But I still look back fondly on it. I think it's a very good Final Fantasy game, and I don't hold my inability to finish it against it.
Right. It also goes back to that sort of cost-fun analysis idea where, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Matt. The notion of, I guess, quality hours. There is kind of that vague, stereotypical straw man argument about AAA titles that are, well, they're open world just to be open world. You have filled your Assassin's Creed with just pointless fetch quests. And you could call that as many tens of hours as you'd like, but how much really good gameplay are you getting out of that? In terms of thinking back to the length of a game being used to determine its value, I definitely think of the PS1 era of all of the turn-based RPGs in the pre-shock and aftermath of Final Fantasy VII, 80 hours, 100 hours, 150-hour game experience, like promised on the box, and it delivered. Whether you wanted it or not, that's up to you. Yes, I am a Persona freak, and I did love those games and still love those sorts of like, oh, you mean I have to get into the menus and manage subsystems? Oh, tell me there's a crafting system. Oh, kind of thing. Yeah, sure. But I remember watching Toonami and seeing that review of Ico.
Yeah.
Right around when the game was coming out, talking about what a cool and artistic game it was. But it's really short. It's only like 4 or 5 hours. And they gave it kind of a middling score for that. Anybody who's played through Ico, it's a hell of an experience. And it's a hell of a game. And it's one that's fine to play again and one that you want to share with other people and definitely would. So is it only 5 hours? We're back to that. And I would put that in the same bucket as, talking about Portal. Portal is a poster child of a game that is not necessarily long, but is quality from start to finish, top to bottom, bursting at the seams of it. Everywhere you look, you find something interesting. And I would sooner take that over 150 hours with some notable moments that's mostly grinding and filler.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to what you want out of a game that you're playing. I mean, a lot of our conversations come down to taste, right? When it comes down to it.
Of course.
And I think a big part of this is that, right? Look, what do you want out of an open world game? I love a streamlined open world game where I'm not running around for 100 hours. Other folks want The Witcher 3, and I get it. I played The Witcher 3 and I loved it, but like, again, I think the thing that daunts me, it's like that Starfield conversation we had with Rachel Coward before the game came out. Like the anxiety of an endless world actually kind of drives me a little crazy because Starfield, for example, which I tried to play and it ended up not working on my computer, which is a whole other problem. Even if I did play it, it would have been on Game Pass. So it would have cost me effectively nothing. I mean, it doesn't cost me nothing, but effectively it's nothing. In the same way, Netflix is nothing. And I think that at that point, the value is just what I'm getting out of the game because I'm not worried about the price. And I think a lot of that is perspective and kind of framing for when you're engaging with those kinds of games.
And this gets into, I think, probably the biggest minefield of the current discussion of honestly just game value. Subscription services.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I am a PlayStation Plus subscriber. I get free games every month. And sometimes they're games I already bought. Does that devalue the game that I did buy? Does that mean I wasted my money? Maybe not necessarily, because I typically buy physically. And if I, on PlayStation Plus, get a game that I already paid for on a physical medium, I will own that game no matter what, even when I cancel my PlayStation Plus subscription, where I will lose access to those games, and the same as any other streaming service. And so, yes, you are effectively getting the game for free if you get it on Game Pass, if you can play it on Nintendo Switch Online, if you can get it on PlayStation Plus. But it's not, because you are paying for a key to the gate. And so from there, this becomes a question of value over time. There's so many games on my shelves right now that I hope to get to, I want to get to, but I also know that as long as they're there, I can get to them. Whereas I can just go, you know what, I don't want to pay the annual fee for PlayStation Plus anymore, and now dozens, hundreds of games, I was like, I can get to those later. I cannot get to them later. That is the weird sort of flip side of why are we paying the same for digital versus physical. And an example where you're not doing that is something like Limited Run, where you are actually paying for a run on the physical. So a game that's $15 on Steam is often $35 on Limited Run, because that's the only way you're going to be getting it in a physical form. And this has definitely caused some conundrums for me, even as much as I love physical games.
For sure. Also, cost is so much more inconsistent now, and also digital games. I mean, it's not just subscriptions, but think about Steam, right? If Steam decided tomorrow that they were going to rescind all of those licenses, that would be it. They'd be gone. You'd lose those games.
I mean, this lends itself towards all of the Unity controversy that was going on earlier this year.
Yeah.
Where Unity was planning on charging a fee above a certain number of downloads for any game that utilized the Unity engine, and that was going to be retroactive. And so several games, including popular ones like Cult of the Lamb, were getting ready for, okay, well, as soon as this goes into effect, we're going to have to remove our games from the marketplace. If you already have it, great. If you need to get it now, because it's going away and we can't allow access to it because we can't afford it.
Right.
And that has been walked back. That has been readjusted. But it was, and still is, a harsh reminder of, the ephemeral quality of your access to these games, regardless of how much or how little you paid or when you paid it and how it gets to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and this next sentence comes with a ton of privilege from the position that I'm in, but the cost of a game is kind of irrelevant to me. And what I mean by that is, like, whether it's a $70 game or a $30 game, I'm paying for the game that I want. If I'm disappointed with a game after I've spent the money on it, I could blame the runtime or that there wasn't enough out of it. But the reality is that's probably the last thing that's going to bother me. The thing that's going to bother me is, did the game work? Did I have fun playing it? Were there glitches? Were there issues? I mean, look, for the ups and downs and all the things that have happened with Cyberpunk, which seems to be an actual functioning and very good game now.
That's what I've heard.
When it first came out, it was unplayable in a lot of ways. And so people who wanted refunds, it totally makes sense, because you're paying for a broken product. And that's a whole separate problem that we have not even touched on the podcast, but we will at some point, living in the patching age and the age where games are released unfinished. And it's almost an expectation that there will be bugs. I mean, the whole Bethesda running gag is that a handful of bugs is to be expected. And it's that Bethesda charm. And I don't want to be like, oh, they shouldn't be releasing broken games, but also they shouldn't be releasing broken games. Games when they were on cartridges, if they had bugs, that was just part of the game, but they couldn't patch those out like they can now. And so it's like a blessing and a curse, but you should be paying for a working product. And I think those kinds of things are more worth being outraged about than just game time.
Yeah.
I'm speaking from a very specific place. A lot of the podcasts I listen to like to talk about the normies, and what I mean by that is like the people who don't follow every industry trend, watch every direct, know every game that's coming out and its release date, and buy a couple of big AAA titles a year. For those people to want 100 hours for $60, there's some logic to that, because you're not buying every single game that comes out. You're buying a couple of games and they're meant to carry you through till the next couple of games that you buy. And there is some logic there, even though I may not necessarily agree with it. But if you're someone who just buys any and all games and buys tons of games a year, for you to complain about runtime just makes less sense to me, because it's like, you have other games to play. Enjoy that tight 10-hour experience and move on to the next thing.
I think, too, where you have that, I guess, let's roll with it, that normie mindset or that normie experience of only a few games, you actually can kind of weather the slow patching of your game. If
Right.
the one game you bought was Cyberpunk, it arrives, crap, this is absolutely unplayable. What the hell am I going to do with this? They fix it, they fix it, they fix it. And they're attending to buyer's remorse almost. And I do share the sentiment that pushing it to we'll fix it in post is always feels like poor management.
Right.
Not bad work on the programmer's part. That feels like poor fucking management.
Agreed.
But there is also the idea of post-release and things like that. A game I definitely think of in terms of value and time and everything else is Trombone Champ.
Yeah.
Which, look, I am all about shopping sales and finding deals. When I go used game shopping, if I see a game that I either have never heard of and I'm intrigued by it, or I see it and it's like, well, that's not one of my, I need this game, but I'm interested. Before I look at the price, I sort of set a ballpark of, okay, what is this worth to me? Do I $10 want this game? Do I $50 want this game? Before checking and kind of adjusting from there. But something like Trombone Champ, I saw what everyone was talking about on it the day it came out, and it's $15. Fine, done, go, give it to me. And I loved it, and I still play it. And being able to do that, and their success meant that they've been able to update it and add to it. And you might play Trombone Champ once and go, this is ridiculous, and I'm moving on with my life. It was fun, but you can't make me be that bad at an instrument I have no interest in anymore. Or you put dozens of hours into it and you work on S ranking things and you just have a wonderful time, like I do. I actually hadn't considered the buyer's remorse fixing idea of if you're only buying one or two $70 games a year, the patching of it can at least fix some things. And for folks in the world that are buying tons and tons of games, if it's not worth it, quote unquote, at the outset, they'll have moved on. I believe No Man's Sky is another example of a game that is actually in a much better place than it was when the gaming public was scrutinizing it. But the damage is done as far as its reputation is concerned.
Right. And many people have gone back to it and enjoyed it, but it does hinder that. And I think that, look, we live in a capitalist society, blah, blah, blah. Like, we have to spend money on games. You have to spend money on art. I think determining value when you can afford to buy games should be based on what you're looking to get out of the experience and less about how long that experience is. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of these experiences are pretty fleeting, right? They go by pretty quick. And look, I'm someone who used to replay Chrono Trigger every year, and I haven't replayed it in several years at this point because of the time that it would take to play it and that I wouldn't be playing other things. Now, again, Geoff and I don't work for a publication. We are very self-managed, and so any of the times and pressure that we put on ourselves to play the latest games is completely self-inflicted. No one's foisting that upon us. There's no deadline we have. I can also be more laissez-faire about the cost versus time because Geoff and I are doing this out of the love and enjoyment. If it is not obvious to our listeners, we are not paying the bills with our Patreon. We love you, and we're grateful for it, and it helps us improve the podcast. But that is not what is paying our bills at home and allowing us to live our life. We have day jobs. We have other things that we do for that income. And so the way I engage with games also, I think, from a time perspective is because I feel a crunch now to get through a bunch of games, mostly because I just want to play them all. It's like I'm holding all of these games. How can I hold all these games? It's a different thing where I can totally see the argument for someone who is more entrenched in the games industry, working for a major publication, also preferring shorter games, mostly so they can get through them because then they have to move on to the next thing because that's their job, which is a whole different perspective that I hadn't even considered till this moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would rather there be more shorter games than more long games as service, because all of the games as service titles have that further demand on your time, but plenty of multiplayer games throw these things off.
Yeah, I mean, also, we haven't even talked about MMOs, and that's a whole different kind of cost versus time mentality, right? When I was playing World of Warcraft regularly, I felt obligated to play it a certain amount of hours a week, so I was getting my value that I was paying monthly. Same with Final Fantasy XIV. That one less so, though, because I could play that as a single-player game, which made it feel more worth it. But after a while, I wasn't playing it, and so I stopped paying for it. I own all of the expansions, even the newest one. So, like, at some point, I'll go back and get through that 10,000 hours worth of game. But, like, at this point, I don't really play many MMOs at all unless I'm playing with friends regularly because it's just not worth it for me.
Yeah, it's the same reason I don't play gacha games.
Right. And I think that cost versus time is different because you want to be able to play the thing you're paying for. If you don't have the time to play it, why continue to pay for it? Games as a service and MMOs is a little different versus a one-time purchase game. There can be overlap in that mentality, but I think they are kind of a whole different animal.
Yeah, you're chasing down your own ideal version of what is getting my money's worth out of this game. I've said more than once on finding a used game, oh, it's $5. I'm going to get $5 of entertainment out of owning this thing. I've already gotten my money's worth knowing that this is coming home with me. Because, yeah, what do movies cost these days? What are the tickets? What's the Blu-ray? What is your actual cost of your subscription services all added up together make for that? And we are all fallible and our own individuals and apply our own rubrics and ideas to these things. Meanwhile, I have recently acquired a whole new crop of PlayStation demo discs. And let me tell you something. Playing through demo discs and the PlayStation Interactive samplers, if you want to talk about something that wildly throws off cost versus entertaining hours, I feel like those are part of it. Those really are a paradox because I know we talked about demo discs and demos in previous episodes, but there are so many of those, certainly PlayStation 1 demos, that folks that grew up with those demos, with that system, with that generation, the number of people that have played the first level of Parappa the Rapper versus actually playing Parappa the Rapper, I feel like it's probably a pretty astronomical difference.
Yeah.
And I would not argue that anybody that played only the demo didn't have a really good time. Or if they played it over and over again, as I know I played it over and over again, I'm not going to calculate how long I spent playing it versus how long of a game experience it is versus it came with my PlayStation. So what does all of that even mean? And so that's one of the other big arguments in this fairly high-minded concept that we've decided to only devote less than an hour to. Let's be real. The idea of, I said it before, and I think this comes back to this. If you are going to have that gaming experience again and again, the concept goes out the window. Because if you're only looking at a game as something you play once and then move on, is very different than going back over and over again. There are short books that people like to always go back and read. There are door stoppers of fantasy or sci-fi series that some folks that are fans, have an annual reread of it. Matt, how many times have you played the Mass Effect trilogy?
No, we don't talk about that.
Exactly. And how long does it take the average person to play the Mass Effect trilogy?
I mean, I think you could probably get through all 3 games in 40 hours, 30 hours. I may be undershooting it a little, but
like first time through, let's call it 50 hours.
Sure,
let's say.
balloon it
and then
out.
Subsequent playthroughs, let's get it down to 30 hours. You play it twice, that's 80 hours. And if you want to play Paragon and Renegade, if you want to try different builds, if you want to do any of those things, and if it's a game that engenders the sort of love that you have for it, and Matt, I know you love that series, but you are far from the biggest Mass Effect fan in existence.
Correct.
And so, just as the same way that every game is potentially somebody's favorite, this whole argument is wild. And it's why we keep having it. And it's why we don't have a definitive conclusion. And I almost don't want a regulating board on it. But I do love hearing what people think about how much where your value comes in your fun, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I came into this conversation more being like, I wanted to finger waggle the people who are like, a 15-hour game shouldn't be $60. But like, the more that we talk about it, the more that I realize I think the monetary value of a video game is irrelevant. It's the cultural value, sure, but also like just the personal value. I think besides the cost, what it means to you matters more, and those gaming experiences that stay with you. Like I value Control higher than, I don't know, Triangle Strategy. 'Cause Triangle Strategy I bought and I haven't even played yet. Control I've played multiple times, multiple versions, the DLC, and I think those different things add to the value of the game. There was a point where I entertained buying the $120 version of Scott Pilgrim, the game, because I love that franchise. I love that. Well, I guess franchise, because the books, the movie, and the game. Like, I enjoy that world so much. Might have been worth it. I ended up not pulling the trigger on that. But I did buy, to your point, I did buy the Legendary Edition, which was more than, I think it was $160, and I got an actual N7 helmet, and I can even wear the helmet. And it didn't even come with the game. I still had to pay $60 or whatever it was for the game. So, like, yeah, I kind of sticking my own foot in my mouth when it comes to this idea. I think I still do personally think it's foolish to complain that game length is the only thing that makes cost worth it. But I do think that the cost to you should be worth it for the experience that you get. What Tears of the Kingdom was $70, right? So I loved the hell out of that game, so much more than Breath of the Wild. So I think I got my $70 worth, and it took me 100 and whatever hours to finish. I think that it would be sad for someone to spend that kind of money, play it for 10 hours and go, I don't like this game.
Of course.
And I wouldn't hold it against them, but it would be a bummer in the same way that, like, I played Elden Ring for 20 hours. But I don't value that game more than Tears of the Kingdom because I enjoyed Tears of the Kingdom more. Not that there's anything wrong with Elden Ring, and I did quite like it. But I also would value Chrono Trigger more than both those games. And it's like a quarter or an eighth of the length and something I've played multiple times. And so I think ultimately what I'm getting to is that there's no definitive answer, but I think for me, personal value and the impression a game leaves on me is worth more than whatever the hour count, graphics, anything else is.
And I think kind of my conclusion here is certainly built off of what you were just saying, Matt, is if you're chasing the value, you're going to be disappointed. If you spend $10 on a game, $70 on a game, $160 on a game, any of those, you could feel like it's going to be worth it no matter what. And it will be. Or I need to get my money's worth out of this. The same way that, speaking to that area of privilege of, the too many games that we have versus the too many games that other folks might have, whatever, if you are worried about starting a 40-hour game and it's like, well, these better be some good 40 hours, and they really have to be, you're going to be looking for excuses as to why it isn't.
Yeah.
In that same way that you're going, no, guys, no, I know it takes 3 hours to set up this board game, but trust me, it's so fun. It's so fun. No, the campaign for North Africa is such a realistic game. It's so fun, you guys. When you're chasing the value of it, I think it stays out of reach far more nimbly than whatever your own personal value for it is. And if you feel like you have to play every game or stay on top of every trend, then you're definitely going to be looking for the justification of how much this costs. Whereas in a game recommendation or a game review, it's that kind of thing of, do you like Mass Effect? Then you're going to like this version of the game, or you're going to like this game that's like it. Do you enjoy Paper Mario? Well, then you're going to love all of these other games that we recommend, whether they are a 5-hour experience or a 90-hour experience, because it is a gameplay loop you enjoy. To say a game is 100 hours says nothing about its quality.
Yeah.
And it could even be the best possible version of that genre or that gameplay experience. But if I only want a little bit of it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. A conversation that started as cost versus game length more evolved into what do you want out of a game?
Right.
What makes video games important to you and what do you want to get out of them? I think about the classic beat 'em ups like I talked about before, like Simpsons and Ninja Turtles and whatever else. And I think even though it was only a half hour long, I enjoyed it because I could play it multiple times. It's one of those things that I think ultimately I've come around to. Why do I play video games? Which I wasn't trying to get to this kind of existential place, but I think ultimately it's what this conversation boils down to, because
I think so.
We could oversimplify it to, is this 30-hour game worth $50? Yes, no, maybe. But that's going to be poisoned by personal opinion in the same way that any good game reviewer has personal opinion in their review, right? Anyone who says that they read game reviews to get a objective opinion is lying to themselves, because it's impossible to kind of do anything objectively. Our influences and our preferences are awash on all the things that we do. You can try and be unbiased. You can try and be open-minded, which are different things. And I think ultimately open-mindedness when buying a game is worth it. But you're right, Geoff. I think going in, well, I spent $60 on this game, it better be good. You're kind of setting yourself up for failure. Whereas if you go, wow, I spent $1 on this, I wonder what's inside. It's that childhood awe and that kind of childish joy that we talk about often that I think kind of fuels this and should fuel how you engage with games. And of course, if you play games for your job, that can affect things too. There are reasons to be more critical as well. I'm not saying that that's not doesn't have value, but as a consumer, as a game player who's not looking to review a game and just engage with it, I think the more open-minded you can be, the better. And that will increase your value versus game time every time.
What is the price point or the value point that for you as an individual, as a gamer, as a consumer, as whatever amount of time you have to contribute to your hobby, your enjoyment? What cost will you shrug off? Will a $1 game that sucks frustrate you as much as a $50 game that sucks? Or does it not matter? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves.
I think ultimately what this comes down to is preference, like we said. And I think that I like these discussions where there's no seemingly right answer. I think ultimately this conversation is really more interesting to me now than it was even when I suggested it, because we kind of talked ourselves into these places where we thought it was A and it could be B, but now it turns out it's the whole alphabet, right? Like there are many reasons to value a game. And I think this conversation is more about the value we derive from video games as a whole, which is well, a way bigger topic that we will probably have to come back to. It's essentially, what do you value from your art kind of conversation. And I think I was just going to try and be like, oh, you shouldn't complain about how long a game is. And like, still, yes, maybe. But like, it became more than that. And I think this is why I love this medium. It's because it's so young, too, that I think it's just not, the answers aren't as obvious as they might be for other forms of media or forms of art.
And one that's both harshly standardized and not at all standardized.
Yeah. So I guess we turn it to you, listeners. What do you value in a game that you buy? Does the cost really matter? Is it more about the experience? Is it more about the game time? Is it more about what you want to get out of that game? I don't think that there are any right answers here. I think that I'd be curious to hear, when you look at a price tag, what's your first thought? Do you not care? Do you go, oh my God, that's too expensive? Do you go, well, what is it worth to me? I'm curious how that internal monologue would go and how you suss out what drives you to want to purchase a game at whatever price you purchase it at.
Right, because a lot of it also comes down to what sort of games are you enjoying and how much are you happy to pay for them. Different genres, different studios, different franchises all have different expectations. A 5-hour Final Fantasy game is going to feel a lot different than a 5-hour Sonic the Hedgehog game.
Yes.
So what are your magic price points? What is the price you'll reasonably pay to play just about anything? What are the times that you thought you paid too much? What are the times that you went, really, you're charging me that much, and it turned out to be the best goddamn experience and the greatest value? How do you go about these things? What has been the best bang for your buck? What is that 3-hour game that's worth $100 to you because you have played it so many times? Because frankly, I want to hear about that game, and if I haven't played it yet, I want to. So please, all of that, all those questions, all those recommendations, let us know. There's so many great ways to get in touch with us. We are Fun and Games Pod across any social media platform that we are on. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. You can also check out everything we've got going on our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. And if you are in a place to financially support us, we would appreciate that. You might even find yourself up on the high scoreboard. Today's high scoreboard is Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Rob Tremarco, Robert Proyne, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. We promise at least a 30-second experience. And if you are unable to support us in that way, you can actually be a free patron and just get updates on what we're up to. It's a great place to just see all of the things we do, even beyond these episodes.
For sure. I actually recently, just as of when we're recording, released an article, my second article on our blog, I guess, if you will, our Patreon, called Matt's Musings, Emulating Relief, How the Analog Pocket Helped Me Combat Burnout and Depression. It started out as like, gee, I get a lot of endorphins from playing the Analog Pocket outside. And it became a lot more than that. It's a great piece that I'm really proud of. Shout out to Brett Eagleston for editing it. That's absolutely free. On the free tier, you can read that. You can also see my posts about the games I've beaten. You can see all of the mainline episodes on there. So there's a ton of really cool stuff. So even if you don't want to pay for the Patreon or can't at this moment, you can subscribe at the free tier and still get a ton of updates. Because as social media continues to catch fire, we are going to lean more on our Patreon to update the folks who are listening.
Whatever way you listen to these podcasts, and if you are listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. It's a great way to get us into the algorithm and to get us a little more notice so more people can join us on this and share with us their favorite games, share with us their experiences, and share that with everyone involved. Because whether you are listening, supporting on Patreon, answering calls to action, whatever it may be, we couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Monin.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey there, Screen Beans. Have you heard about Screen Snark?
Rachel, this is an ad break. They aren't screen beans until they listen to the show.
Fine. Potential Screen Beans. You like movies and TV shows, right?
I mean, who doesn't? Screen Snark is a casual conversation about the movies and television shows that are shaping us as we live our everyday lives.
That's right, Matt. We have a chat with at least one incredible guest every episode, hailing from all walks. We've interviewed chefs,
Writers, costumers, musicians,
yoga teachers, comedians, burlesque dancers,
folks in the film and TV industry,
and more.
We'd be delighted for you to join us every other Monday on the Certain POV Podcast Network.
Or wherever you get your podcasts, fresh and tasty off the presses.
What? That's not.
Can I call them Screen Beans now?
Fine.
Screen Beans.
So tune in and we'll see you at the movies or on a couch somewhere.
'Cause you're a whole Screen Beans now.
She will be mine.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.